She took an artist's pen to a microscopic world of sound, and in so doing became one of the all-time greats. I'm the classical nerd, and today we're talking about Kaija Saariaho. Kaija Laconisme was born in 1952 in Helsinki, Finland, a sickly kid with an extraordinary musical imagination. She reported hearing music coming from her pillow as a child, not realizing for a while that she was actually listening to what was going on in her own head. Music, and the arts in general, hold an important place in Finnish education, and she played violin, guitar, piano, and organ. None of them well enough to her satisfaction. She compared her early compositions to Mozart, and not in like an, wow, I'm the second coming of Mozart kind of way, and more in a, wow, Mozart was really good at this and I really suck kind of way.
It is a sobering thought, for example, that when Mozart was my age, he had been dead for 2 years.
Her parents had grown up as poor migrants who had escaped the Soviet annexation of Karelia, and they'd made it to the middle class by the time that Kaija came along. She was acutely aware of her lack of high culture, let's say. More generally, though, she had only male role models in composition, and heroic national figures at that. Sibelius is still very much loved by the Finns. Her parents, who would go on to be pretty big collectors of visual art, didn't care much for their daughter's compositional aspirations. They had hoped that she would leverage her visual art skills to become an architect. Kaija was briefly married to Markku Saariaho, which is where she got the last name. This Saariaho was an architect, and they were married for less than a year. So longer than Britney Spears' first marriage, but not by all that much. She kept the new name, in part because changing it back would have been a hassle, and also part of this relationship was about separating herself from her then unsupportive parents. She didn't hate Markku, but she certainly wasn't in love with him. Her subsequent 7-year relationship with painter Ale Luutikainen reinforced her desire to be a creative artist. Luutikainen was her introduction to Helsinki's artistic counterculture, which admired the work of Finnish modernists who had flourished in the 1920s and 1930s. This was an early and critical aspect of Saariaho's development that, due in part to her eventual traumatic falling out with the jealous and alcoholic Luutikainen, was not something on which she liked to dwell. In any event, cultural development in Finland existed in the shadow of the Soviet Union, which had an outsized influence on Finnish politics at least through the 1980s. All the same, Finland's official neutrality allowed Finnish composers to get influences from the West. This odd cultural position allowed Finnish composers to use a multitude of techniques in the same works, and the Finnish countercultural movement, happening at the same time, embraced multimedia works that examined the interaction between the human and the machine. Finnish countercultural groups like the Harvesters, of which Luutikainen was a member, embraced anything that cut against the socialist realism imported over from the USSR. Members of this group often collaborated on multimedia Fluxus-inspired anti-art under the name Leo Ruskanen, which may or may not be funny in Finnish, I have no idea. The other major group of this sort was Demensio, also really into multimedia and optimistic about the artistic possibilities offered by computers. There's no evidence that links Saariaho to this group in particular, but that is a theme that comes back in her later work, so it was in the zeitgeist. Believing that she needed to study and know what she was doing in her art, in 1976, Saariaho went to the Sibelius Academy, and after facing some sexist resistance among the faculty, insisted that Paavo Heinonen accept her into his studio. Like, she was super shy, and she used all of her willpower to sit down in his office and just stay there until he agreed to take her on as a student in what was, at that point, a full class.
I'm staying right here! Right here!
Heinonen was the most rigidly serial, and one of the most well-versed internationally of the Finnish composers then working. He stuck with serialism beyond its Finnish heyday in the 1960s. Finns of Saariaho's generation preferred the approach of Erik Bergman, who played faster and looser with serial technique. Heinonen belonged to a particularly severe school of serial composition that forbade octave doubling in orchestrations. According to Saariaho, he never had anything good to say, and was also a father figure. Just gonna leave that one there. She still had this problem of role models and self-doubt. She fell back on the work of artistic women in other fields. Heinonen wasn't having any of this negativity. He thought of teaching composition as asking questions and never answering them, never forcing his students to do any one thing in their music. He did, however, force her to look at herself in the mirror and do affirmations. Like 10 or 20 times a day, she was supposed to tell herself, "I can." Except in Finnish, I assume.
I am successful, I am powerful, I am handsome, I am happy. Successful, powerful, handsome, happy.
She credited Heinonen with helping her rediscover her childhood instinct for sonic creativity. Help her rediscover that pillow music, I guess. She tried to fall back on setting texts. Heinonen forced her to write instrumental music. Saariaho compared this to an alcoholic having to go cold turkey. Saariaho was so addicted to setting texts, she said she would hear music even when she read the telephone book. This shy wannabe composer was now coming into her own and putting herself out there, co-founding a society called Korvat Auki, Finnish for Ears Open, in 1977. This was initially an informal and somewhat pretentious forum for talking shop about all the avant-garde music that the Sibelius Academy was afraid of discussing. Group members recalled trying to show off their intellect to one another. Korvat Auki expanded until in 1982 they formed their own ensemble, Toimi, initially for a performance of Stockhausen's Plus Minus. Korvat Auki did this end around to the concert hall because, at least in Saariaho's case, she didn't think they had the right acoustics for contemporary music, unsurprising in a musical culture that valued the late romanticism of Jean Sibelius. Their guiding principles? No tonality, no modality, nothing easy to understand. Saariaho wanted to create her own acoustics, which would be her gateway to the electronic studio, about which much more later. Her last piece composed at the Academy was also her first commission, her first published work, and first mature piece. Well, that's kind of debatable, but it was an important work. Im Trauma for cello and piano, which inaugurated a theme of dreams in her work. She kept a dream diary and had a scholarly interest in Freud's theories on the subject. And in this piece, the harmony stays static, while the textures and dynamics undergo rapid shifts. Saariaho's music can be thought of as a series of spectra, and the most important spectrum in her work is the one that goes between stasis and dynamism, where stasis meant pitch and traditional instrumental technique, while dynamism meant noise, extended techniques, and often proportional notation, or something non-standard in that regard. For her, it meant something like the way that traditional classical composers would use consonance and dissonance. This was another way of articulating a larger compositional concern, that of tension and release. This could be as simple as the amount of speaking or breathiness in a vocal line, such as in her Sylvia Plath setting From the Grammar of Dreams, which introduced two different kinds of noise, something she had done in choral music as early as 1979, in her Suomen kielinen sekkakuoro kappale.
I remember the cadavers and Doreen and cannot touch and the story of the fig tree and my and Marco's time and the Cello and common dress and my wife and Doctor goes to war, I nurse and 1920 and Martha Broken with his like
The Darmstadt summer courses, which she attended on Hannon's suggestion, were a meeting point of the musical movements bubbling across Europe, from the impossible complexity of Brian Fernihoe to the French spectral school of Gerard Grisey and Tristan Mirail. Darmstadt was, to paraphrase the composer herself, something of a crystallizing moment. Spectral music was unheard in Finland. No one was playing it. She loved the lush fusions of harmony and timbre, and realized that the complex systems and structures of Fernihoe and his disciples didn't resonate. To that end, she always hated what she called paper music. She left Finland in 1981 and would never make her permanent home there ever again. The musical culture was small, and she didn't like being the only woman in these circles. Her first step was the Hochschule für Musik Freiburg, for a 2-year degree where Fernihoe was a part-time lecturer. It's a good case study for how compositional style and teaching aren't always linked. Fernihoe's music did nothing for Saariaho, but he loved digging into music different from his, while Gerard Grisey, who was a little bit closer to what she liked, told people he basically couldn't do anything useful for you unless you were trying to write like him. Which, I mean, hey, at least he was honest about it. Under Fernihoe, Saariaho completed Saden Vögel, where instead of clear sections of music defined by oppositional forces, she understood noise and pitch as ends of a spectrum. And this music is characterized by smooth transition rather than sudden jumps, something she called a scale formed by tonal colors. Thinking of parameters as spectra isn't new. What's different about Saariaho is that she approached this idea from her exposure to other art forms. She credited Andrei Tarkovsky's 1979 film Stalker in the way Tarkovsky used color to show location. Saariaho constructed her tonal color scales from intuition at first, aided by her synesthesia that linked timbres to colors. When she could spectrally analyze timbre with the aid of then cutting-edge technology, the scale could be more systematized, but it started as something that she was just doing purely by ear. She had moved to Freiburg to be somewhere unequivocally in the Western Bloc, but she didn't think West Germany was much better than Finland. The terrorist activities of the Baader-Meinhof gang prompted her to move somewhere further west, somewhere closer to her aesthetic sensibilities. and she landed in Paris, France. She was accepted to IRCAM in January 1982 on the strength of several early tape compositions. Cartolina per Siena, a mix of her voice and bell sounds, realized with fellow composer Uke Parmerud, and parts of a large multimedia project called Study for Life. Much of this was done at the Finnish Broadcasting Company's experimental studio, which was one of Europe's more basic electronic studios, but one which had thousands and thousands of stock sound effects on tape, ready to be manipulated. IRCAM could take her much, much further. Alright, time out for a second. When I did my big video on spectralism a couple of years ago, a few people got pretty indignant that I didn't get into Saariaho. The subtext being that it was out of sexism or, general stupidity. But to my ears, and when I look at the historical record, and when I read what other folks have written about Saariaho, she strikes me as more of a post-spectralist, and I didn't really talk about post-spectralists. Look, I'll be the first to admit, the line can be hard to define. For me, it's anyone who A, comes after the first generation of a movement, and B, absorbs the sound without being dogmatically tied to procedures or aesthetic rigor. Someone who plays faster and looser, who might use that ism as a primary tool in their toolbox, but not restrictively. So by that definition, I would tip Saariaho over into the post-spectral camp, and I'm far from alone here. Saariaho herself said that she wasn't a spectralist, because for her, that meant Griset's approach, and she called that very systematic. So she was inspired by spectralism, but in the sense that she was also inspired by a general French sound and sensibility, a love of tone color that went all the way back to Debussy, Ravel, even before them. Saariaho also used serialism as one of many tools, and if it gave her something she didn't like, she did not feel obliged to keep it. Hence a lot of things, especially in her early mature period, that look like they might be serial, but don't scan as such upon further analysis. 12-tone collections were sonic references to that particular brand of modernism. She was more likely to use it to structure rhythm within a piece, as she did with permutating Fibonacci-derived rhythmic cells in Im Träume. Saariaho used serial technique to generate potential material, more material than needed for a given piece, which she could then organize. She did the exact same thing with spectral technique. It's just a little more obvious that she's inspired by spectralism, hence she's post-spectral and not post-serial. Another way to think about this is thinking about spectralism as the conflation of harmony and timbre, and post-spectralism as taking that fusional impulse and applying it to other dimensions. For Saariaho, it would be like fusing electronics and acoustic instruments. In her best work, it's kind of hard to distinguish where one starts and the other stops, even when listening to a recording and tracking along with the score. And also, she explored text and poetry, from her earliest years at the Sibelius Academy through to her later operas and plenty of vocal works in between. You see this desire to fuse speech and playing from Laconisme de l'aile onwards, to varying degrees of legibility depending on what the piece required, with l'on something of a high watermark for both of these interests. It has both a soprano and spatialized electronic sound. Text, in and of itself, is another point in the post-spectral camp. Not that the OG spectralists didn't use the human voice, it's just that if you're going to write 2 hours of opera, you have to have some way of thinking melodically. So when Saariaho arrived at IRCAM, spectral processing was one of the tools available on some of the most state-of-the-art machines then running. And I think Saariaho is at her most spectral in her early to early-middle orchestrations. Spectral analysis was only the first step to creating her distinctive harmonies. A lot of it was intuitively changing these chords until they had the right fragrance, in her words. Harmony came first, and text if she was using that. Then she could figure out the form and the proportions of the piece, instrumentation and playing techniques. The map had to be complete before a single note went onto the page. Into the early 90s, Saariaho wrote out a first draft and then edited that into a final manuscript. At IRCAM, Saariaho had some spectralist starting points, like using software to slow down and analyze the inner workings of single sounds. But where Grisey would turn around and orchestrate those sounds, and Mirai would warp them while doing FM synthesis to derive new pitches, Saariaho used that to determine her performers' techniques, to determine what electronic processing she might use on those sounds. In purely electronic music, Saariaho was obsessed with the in-between of various sounds, not necessarily the sounds themselves. She liked the slow transformation of one sonority into another. IRCAM had several in-house programs for synthesis, like Chant, a voice synthesis engine developed by a team led by Xavier Rodet and Gerald Bennett. This recreated vocal sounds with oscillators that mimicked sound production in the throat, and filters that emulated the way the mouth and the head shape that starting sound. They looked at singers, sometimes with X-rays, as though the singers were synthesizers, and they built their own synthesizer accordingly. Chant accepted data pairs, so for any given XY pair, it would get to X state in Y seconds for that one particular parameter. If it's a vowel or something, it would get to like A to O in 5 seconds. For a composer obsessed with smooth transitions between extremes, these programs were right up her alley. The technical term for this is interpolation, where a computer will calculate a series of transitional states given 2 or more data points. Now, if you can digitize enough parameters, you could calculate a halfway point between anything, like a scream and a big fat C major chord. It's technically doable, you just have to find a way to digitize it first. Take Vers le Blanc, where artificial voices slowly glide from one trichord to another over 15 minutes. Using Chant, she started at the furthest, starkest place she could. The entire piece is one slow interpolation. The score doesn't do the piece justice, because pitch kinda isn't the point here. Saariaho's notes show her care in crafting changes in timbre over time, and it's no accident that Chant made sounds like human voices, because noise and pitch are also a thing with the human voice. Right now, you don't hear my voice as singing, because my vocal cords aren't vibrating harmonically. I'm creating inharmonic partials. But if I slowly transition into singing, something really interesting happens at that threshold. Amen. She was in the right place at the right time. Music technology moves so fast that by the end of the 80s, these programs were obsolete. But Saariaho made a lasting impact at IRCAM in 1984. When she and Jan van den Heide invented a subroutine in Forms, the program that coordinated Chant subprograms, called Transkaja, which expanded the interpolation.
We became the woke department.
Chant could take you from one point to another, while Transkaja could interpolate between different patterns. So you could give it a starting rhythm and an ending rhythm, and it could go seamlessly between those. So more technically, it's a way of interpolating between lists rather than interpolating between single data points, and these transformations could occur over curves rather than lines. So it gives you several more dimensions of control over this interpolation. Jardin Secret 1 was her first major piece that used Transkaya, and the whole trilogy of pieces with that title, as different as they are, started with this idea of interpolation. And it's one of the big reasons I hear Saariaho as a post-spectralist. Spectral composers used harmonicity and inharmonicity to refer to how closely their timbres corresponded to the naturally occurring overtone series. Saariaho used the same terminology, but used it to refer to completely different things. Saariaho extended this idea to divisions of the octave. More divisions of the octave were equal to more noisy and more inharmonic. I'm not sure I hear it that way, but point is, that was another parameter of music that could be controlled. To her, things that sounded like bells or voices were more inharmonic, while timbres with more symmetrically arranged partials were harmonic. Again, totally different from what the OG spectralists thought, and its final composition came by old-school magnetic tape splicing from a set of different computer outputs. For Jardin Secret 2, the point was to combine the resources of IRCAM and its erstwhile competitor, the Groupe de Recherche Musicale, or GRM. Saariaho felt that IRCAM had better programs, but GRM had more robust sounds, because they had a suite of digital tools. The harpsichord's fast and very prominent attack made it the perfect pairing for the tape. And I am, among other things, a noted harpsichord hater, so the fact I think this does a good job really should tell you something. The harpsichord's material was based on complex rhythmic interpolations, so the computer spit out numbers along a continuum, and like I talked about in my Nankara video, musical notation is just too inherently grid-like, so Saariaho had to go through the numbers and figure out what approximate rhythms made the most sense. IRCAM was a composer's dream, designed to encourage collaboration. It was also highly gendered and extremely competitive. Composers there are assigned assistants to help with the technical side of their projects, and when she was there, all of them, save for herself, were men. Often junior composers who were denied co-compositional or collaborative credit on the pieces they helped realize. In some cases, they felt that they were more responsible for the pieces than the senior composers who got the credit. Women were employed there, but as part of the non-creative support team. Saariaho said that these assistants had a problematic relationship with music. As a rule, she found them so high-strung, she had to learn to treat them with kid gloves to spare their feelings of being pushed around by a woman. She tried being, normal with them, but that led to what she called, quote, a couple of catastrophic experiences, unquote.
The woke department.
She couldn't be herself at IRCAM, and she couldn't even treat her assistants like her male colleagues treated theirs. She became more technically proficient than her colleagues just to be taken seriously. She wasn't really keen on learning the nitty-gritty of programming, that's what the assistants were for, but she learned a programming language called Lisp so she could use IRCAM's in-house programs, which were all Lisp-based at the time. Her official time at IRCAM ended in 1982, but she stayed around until 1986 in an informal capacity. She had met her future husband, Jean-Baptiste Berrière, then one of the junior tutors at IRCAM. He would let her in, and they would stick around after hours to use the central computer on adjacent terminals. Aww. This allowed her to hear all the possible sounds these programs could generate. Synthesizing a sound on the central computer took a long time, and anything you made got pumped out to the whole building. She had more time than anyone, except maybe Berrière, to really get to know these programs and use them as part of her creative practice. They're part of a feedback loop. She really got to know them as an extension of her own creativity. And she did this even if the reviews back home weren't great. Her big orchestral piece, Verblindungen, where orchestra and tape with raw material from two violin sounds slowly swap places on the pitch-noise axis over the course of almost 15 minutes, was her first major piece not written under the tutelage of a teacher. and it was not well received in Finland. For a while, it seemed that everybody liked her but her own people. She thought it was stiff, and it's rarely performed today. I think what she hears as stiff is the problem that I have with live performers playing to what we now call fixed media. It constrains a performance that would otherwise be loose and breathe a bit more. The same ensemble playing the same piece twice in a row isn't going to play it in exactly the same number of seconds, but if you're syncing up with a tape, you kind of have to do that. Conducting an orchestra under these circumstances, said Pierre Boulez, was un remitting total. Which is a little much, but it's par for the course for Boulez. It requires some unique workarounds. As the Pekka Salonen had a really good one. He used a metronome that vibrated in his pocket. Saariaho's interests in the studio and in her synthesis led her to work closely with a number of performers who played instruments that mapped well onto her ideas. Some instruments have much finer control over certain parameters, so there's a wider spectrum of noise to pitch available. The two major instruments that she loved were the flute and the cello. Let's start with the former. I like to think of Saariaho's writing as less for flute and more for flutist. I don't say flautist, because you don't play the flout, do ya? The flute, unique among Western wind instruments, allows for a smooth spectrum from speaking to speaking through the instrument, to airy playing, to traditional playing. There are more opportunities to explore the noise-pitch spectrum, which also overlaps with a legibility-illegibility spectrum. Her first performed piece was a 1977 song called Bruden, and within 5 years, she'd written Laconisme de l'aile. Saariaho was interested in text from the very beginning of her work, and when forced to write instrumental music, that interest in text is still there. In a good performance of this piece, the whispered text will meld into and out of the flute sound. She used the whole flute family throughout her work, but this piece and NoaNoa are the two works for solo concert flute and electronics. The former's optional electronics include reverb and a harmonizer that can do quarter tones. NoaNoa, written 10 years later, extends the sound world Saariaho had started. and was conceived with electronics from the very start. The reverb is integral to the structure of the work. Saariaho developed close working relationships with certain performers. Her outsized interest in the flute and cello can be traced to her collaborations with flutist Camila Huitenga and cellist Anssi Kartunen. The source of her interest is a kind of chicken or egg question. Both of these instruments have wide ranges and playing techniques that can alter the spectral content. Let's compare the flute to the other woodwinds. The oboe only has a little over 2 octaves in range, and while the clarinet has a really big range, the clarinet sounds like a clarinet because it only has the odd-numbered harmonics. So it's interesting spectrally, but not really as useful. And the bassoon, we don't talk about the bassoon. It's the least acoustically understood woodwind even to this day. There's something on that thing called a pancake key. I've learned not to ask any questions. The cello also has a huge range. Of the orchestral bowed strings, the viola and the double bass are usually built a little too small for their strings so they can be playable. As a result, they're not as resonant as the violin or the cello. The violin's higher pitch means players have less control over pitch fine-tuning in the upper register. The strings are shorter, which leads to a less harmonically rich timbre. The cello's size, on the other hand, means the player has finer control over things like bow placement, which was very important to her timbral studies. With Anssi Kartunen, Saariaho did timbral analysis of how different bow positions and bow pressures affected the timbre. It's common knowledge today that sul ponticello, moving the bow closer to the bridge, produces a glassier timbre by brightening the overtones. On larger strings, like the double bass, you can get so ponticello that the fundamental tone disappears entirely. Saariaho didn't take this for granted. She wanted to know exactly what was happening here on a scientific level, and what partials were coming through as the cellist moves through different bow positions. From this collaborative research, Saariaho explored how these harmonics change when detuning strings, and she developed a finger pressure trill technique where the cellist has to quickly go between regular left-hand pressure and harmonic left-hand pressure. A classic Saariaho string part will have minimal change in pitch, but a lot of change in playing technique and dynamics, including gradual overpressure on the bow to explore the boundary between pitch and noise. In some respects, the flute and cello are similar, at least relative to their respective orchestral families, but she liked them for different reasons. The flute has an inherent breathiness, and it's so close to the human voice, another of her favorite instruments, all techniques that she shows from the very start of her career. At its best, all of these extended flute techniques and added electronics combine to create a hyper-instrument of body, breath, flute, and processing, a whole greater than the sum of its parts. I find her solo flute music especially satisfying, because solo flute music can be both hard to write well and really boring to listen to. You can also hear the influence of Japanese music in her flute music, because the breathiness evokes the shakuhachi, the bamboo flute from Japan. Between her flute music and the overtly Japanese Six Japanese Gardens, you could argue that while Japanese aesthetics are not a major part of her work, there is perhaps a better musicological case for a Japanese sound in her music than there is a Finnish one. Cue the fights. I know in my George Crumb video, I said I wasn't a huge fan of speaking while playing, because in Crumb, it just sounds kind of corny to me to have like a pianist stand up and shout in the middle of a piece. In Saariaho, it works. She uses it differently. And like Crumb, her music is full of all sorts of techniques and sounds that have become part and parcel of the contemporary music sound. Saariaho asks for whispers and other vocal effects outside her wind writing, like the Arseny Tarkovsky lines recited by the quartet in Nymphaea. Saariaho isn't trying to make the text legible. She wants the effect, the sound of processed whispers, as a component of the piece, and the words have deep meaning to the nature of the piece. All of these things just work in Saariaho because she was interested in the result. She was thinking about the slow evolution of one thing into another, such that things like bow scrapes can just sound right in their context. I've heard too many pieces by composers who are thinking in fragmented gestures, or just about the theatricality of the piece that they're writing. They write the same sorts of sounds, but they don't have that same sense of context and the sense of things being in the right place in the form. Pirkko Moisala, in her introduction to Saariaho, divides her music into 7 distinct periods. I'm usually pretty skeptical about doing this sort of era division for anybody short of Taylor Swift, and especially here, where I think they're kind of arbitrary points on a spectrum. Regardless of how or if you chunk up her career, there is no doubt that Saariaho had a single watershed piece that put her on the map. And that piece was Lichtbogen, the first in a set of big commissions from the latter half of the 1980s, and its success landed her an official position at IRCAM. It wasn't her first mature piece, it just happened to be the piece that gained her the most international attention, and because of that, I actually think this is one of the big reasons people see her as a spectralist. It was inspired by the northern lights she saw in the northern Finnish region of Lapland in December 1984, and each section is based on analysis of the overtones of cello harmonics being played at varying bow pressures. She spends significant time orchestrating each sonorous section with shimmering strings and gently polyrhythmic percussion. The first, 2 minutes of Lichtbogen is all on F sharp, so the focus is just on timbre and texture. At its best, you can't tell where the instruments end and the electronics begin. All the processing was done on IRCAM's IANA software, which was a subset of a different program called Crime. It could translate results into notation instead of making the composer do all the work. I guess crime really does pay. IANA used a form of Fourier transform to break a signal down into different components, the pitch of each partial and how loud it was. I've made a valiant effort on several occasions to understand Fourier transform, but I just can't get my head around complex numbers. The point is, it can take a signal and break it down, break it apart. That's how you do spectral analysis. Because computer analysis was only the first step, and intuition played a role between the raw material and the finished product, this means that once you get past the more truly spectral early pieces like Lichtbogen, Saariaho's music becomes harder to analyze. I suspect that the straightforwardly spectral nature of this piece is also a factor in tipping her over into the fully spectral fold for people who believe that. But Saariaho took the output of this straightforward tool, and whereas a strict spectral composer would say, here's the raw material, let's just use it, she changed octaves, she took notes out, she transposed whole sections, she added notes in. Even in a piece that sounds very straightforwardly spectral, it's still not quite. Saariaho's music explores concepts from electronic music transferred into acoustic instruments, the biggest one being that continuum between pitch and noise. The more complex the overtone structure, the more inharmonic partials a sound has, the more noisy it is. To take Lichtbogen, the string overpressure and the area whispering through the flute are examples of noisier and rougher sounds, while string harmonics and the high plucked strings and metallic percussion are examples of purer and smoother sounds. Electronics in her work are often in solo pieces as a partner or extension for the solo instrument. In ensembles, they offer a basis for the musical materials and a further layer of processing. Her use of electronics was never maximalist. Saariaho's work with electronics and adjusting very small elements of a timbre refined her ears to the wealth of possibilities available by adjusting things like playing techniques on analog instruments. Kaatainen and Saariaho settled on two fragments: increasing bow pressure while moving from ordinario to sul tasto, think of moving the bow up and into the instrument, and a glissando between two harmonics, which give more settled pitch content on both ends and more noisy, indistinct material in the middle. This was all she needed to find the harmonic world of Lichtbogen. After this breakthrough, it was commission after commission, success after success. In pieces like Io, written for IRCAM's 10th anniversary, you can see her treatment of instrumental writing with microscopic precision and clarity. She had to think about things like vibrato, not as an expressive tool for a performer, but as a formalized, interpolatable parameter in software. You can't fully understand her instrumental music without understanding how it's informed by her work in the studio. Worth mentioning here also is her work with cognitive scientist Stephen McAdams on psychoacoustics, and their research gave her new insight into human perception. Saariaho was a ridiculously prolific composer, and as usual with these sorts of characters, it's impossible to mention everyone's favorite piece. But I will mention another turning point of her career, the diptych Du Cristal à la Fumée, which she thought of as two halves of one piece. Du Cristal is an extended meditation on the opening bell-like chord, and is more structurally static than à la Fumée, which subsequently birthed a trio, Cendre, with its title and material relating. Saariaho understood this music as the end of a period in her compositional career. Up until that point, her music had been very linear, all about moving from point A to point B on one or more levels. After that, Saariaho turned to numerical series for large-scale structure. Her first ballet, Ma, has 7 movements, totaling 70 minutes, where the interior structure of each movement mirrors the proportion of the movements within the whole. It's fractals, basically. What's odd is that other composers to do this, like Charles Warden, approach this as a way to apply serial technique to larger and larger levels of structure, all controlled by one row. Saariaho used it because she didn't want large-scale form to be tied into small-scale origins. Because Saariaho's materials began with computer analysis, she made more material than could fit into any one piece. There's a sense in her work that everything is connected. Spectral technique is kind of perfect for this, actually. If you think about analyzing a timbre in terms of its spectrum, you're essentially turning a timbre into a chord, and that is harmonic material. For her string quartet Nymphaea, which is based on spectrally analyzed cello sounds, she wrote a standalone cello spin-off. Nymphaea is named after a genus of water lilies, so the cello piece was called Petals. And Nymphaea itself is parenthetically Jardin Secret 3, which places it as a sequel to the earlier tape and harpsichord and tape pieces in that series, not to mention the later string orchestra piece Nymphaea Reflection, which are string orchestrations of the electronic part of Nymphaea, and Nymphaea itself was only composed after the advent of digital mixers, because the piece couldn't reasonably exist until technology had caught up. Likewise, Lawn for soprano electronics was in some ways a preparatory piece for operatic composition, and after she had written her first opera, she wrote a 5-movement orchestral song cycle she called 5 Reflections on the opera, and then after that, another called 4 Instants. This was facilitated by a change of approach. From 1990 onwards, Saariaho began reusing spectral analyses between pieces. This sped up the process, since she never had a shortage of commissions, and it contributed to a Saariaho sound. Because she used the analyses as starting points, the modifications are different, so it's not really obvious the two pieces might include the same genetic material, if you will. It's like if I didn't know a potato chip and mashed potatoes were made out of the same ingredient, I'm not sure that I would know. Pieces would also share starting points, like a low E flat on the cello played in different ways. Saariaho used this throughout the 1990s, in pieces like Amer and Cendre. In contemporary terms, a lot of what Saariaho did was basic signal processing, and a big chunk of that was just amplification. Saariaho didn't use it in a unique way. Usually composers ask for it to correct balance issues with a quiet instrument or to beef up quieter sounds, as she did in À la Fumée, to help the cello and alto flute project in front of an orchestra. Unamplified concert flute is hard enough to hear against an orchestra. The alto flute, which is pitched a fourth lower, exaggerates this problem. For a few pieces in the early 90s, she experimented with this IRCAM setup where each of the cello's 4 strings got separate amplification. An interesting concept, but ultimately unwieldy. There are also reverb and echoing effects. Usually this is to create a sense of space that's markedly different from where the piece is actually being performed. You'll see something called infinite reverb in pieces like NoaNoa, and the most interesting use of this, I find, is when the processing plays against type. In Petals, the echo affects the quietest sounds the longest. The piece exists in this alienated funhouse mirror where you can't really imagine what the space could possibly look like just by hearing. Other effects in Saariaho include a harmonizer, which can thicken textures by creating parallel bands of cluster chords, and spatialization, sending material out to particular speakers. This began with Jardin Secret 2. Again, none of this is unique to her. She was using it as a tool in her toolbox. The processing in her work is usually pretty minimal. It's just the right amount of amplification over here, the right amount of reverb over there, all done at the right time, enough to bring out the quiet sounds and transform even the tiniest hall into a cathedral. Laconisme de Lele has optional electronics. The piece doesn't rely on them structurally, and if it's played in resonant enough hall, you'd probably get most of the way there. Saariaho added the electronics to this piece in 1996, 14 years after it was finished, when Camilla Huetanga wanted to play it on a concert where every other piece had electronics, and she didn't want to leave her favorite composer as the only acoustically represented composer on the program. Also, electronics can be unstable and difficult to control. On the one hand, something impossible one year will require specialized equipment the next, and before long, you're going to be able to do it on your laptop. The rate of technological advancement is staggering. That also means constant reworking of electronic parts to fit new softwares and emergent industry standards. It's not the same as slapping a double bar on the end and just calling it a day. Her electronic parts are now all Maxim SP patches available on her official website, even the ones that are just triggered tape playback. The tape parts, we usually just call them fixed media now, because who of my generation has ever seen magnetic tape? Those are so fixed and so rigid, it destroys a lot of what live musicians can bring to the table. I have never been satisfied with using them in my own creative work. When Saariaho was first working at IRCAM, tape parts were easier to realize than live processing, then still in its infancy. As it became easier to live process, she switched over to that. As electronics matured, her use of them changed as well. Especially into the 21st century, Saariaho would leave out amplification from pieces that would have probably had electronics if they'd been written earlier. Cette Papillon for solo cello is one such piece. The incidental sounds and quiet noises get no help projecting. Moisala suggests that Saariaho wants her listeners to really tune into what the cello is doing. I think it's probably because amplification doesn't do as much in a solo piece as it does in correcting orchestration issues. Also, composers have no control over the size or resonance of the rooms in which their pieces are played. If you ask for less, the more performances you're going to get. To that end, her electronic parts are always structured in percentages to give the technician creative control to fit the music into the space. In the acoustic world, she also edited dynamics when revising works, because she found them harder to predict the larger the ensemble. Saariaho's music and its reception has always been colored by the specter of sexism. This seems especially true for Finnish musical criticism. She also just worked in what was still and remains a pretty male-dominated field. When her music first started getting attention, she knew that her colleagues thought it was because of her novelty position as a woman, and when her international reputation finally made it back home, she felt forced into the role of woman composer. The implication was that her music was, in some way, feminine. And she didn't want that. She had a real distaste for questions about, what is it like to be a woman composer? She's like, how would I know the difference? True equality, after all, would mean creating a world where a composer's gender meant nothing to their listeners. And she pointed out that Finnish culture remained starkly patriarchal even as they performed feminism. Throughout most of her career, Finland would laud her, but wouldn't host many premieres. Moisala goes as far as to say that were Sibelius and Saariaho not from the same country, no one would bother comparing them. And while I'm not sure I agree with that, there is a question of how Finnish in music Saariaho really was, because she had all these French influences, and she mostly worked outside the country. Saariaho rarely held teaching positions and always remained shy. She said that in their own ways, neither Paris nor Helsinki felt like home to her. She lived most of her life in a city away from most of her friends, whose culture and language she never fully mastered. In her student days, when the woman composer was getting singled out, the only other such composer than working in Finland was the conservative Helvi Leiviska. At one point, Saariaho dressed more masculinely. She smoked cigars to try to fit in with a boys' club who modeled themselves after Sibelius. Even during her IRCAM years, where she had to contend with messy gender politics within that hierarchy, she presented more masculinely, with a short, cropped haircut. Later, she felt a connection between her femininity and musical communication, particularly in reclaiming the lullaby from sexist stereotypes. She recalled a professor in Freiburg telling her that women who have children only write lullabies after they have children. And while composing Nuit Adieu, a lullaby to her late grandmother, she thought of how rare it was for music to carry that much love and meaning. She reclaimed the lullaby in a way that reinforced her distaste of paper music. In her middle age, Saariaho couldn't say the extent to which early criticisms of her work were because she was a woman or because she was a young composer. The more famous she got, the more people would tell her that she actually had an advantage. She steered clear of any concert or any event dedicated to women composers. And this is a sentiment I've actually heard a lot. Like, women are still a minority in composition, and a common fear is that participating in these events profits from and perpetuates that marginalization. And Saariaho was not just a big fish in a small pond, she was a big fish in her own right. I wonder what Finland's national fish is. Apparently it's something called the European perch. Sounds tasty. In the 1980s, Saariaho said that she would never write an opera, but she always loved text, the human voice, collaborating with other artists, and of course she had that synesthesia. The classic case is the conflation of sound and light. Synesthetic people often see certain colors for certain keys or timbres. In her case, sounds had visual and tactile information as well. They had sense, they had feelings, they even had past experiences. The senses, she said, must not be firmly delineated. This one-time opera hater in her later career didn't just write operas. She was, in my view, primarily an opera composer for the last 20 years of her life. Her operas are, in her words, fundamentally private music. And this tendency towards privacy steered her from opera for a long time. But opera, even on a big stage, can be about small things. The relationship between a couple who are separated. Or the inner life of one person's mind. I think she didn't do opera because she had done a lot of work for the stage, and she'd written a number of multimedia pieces, many of which had strong political themes. Saariaho de facto withdrew a lot of these pieces, since they used magnetic tape in whole or in part, and she chose not to transfer them in any way. This is highlighted by her choice to restore her multimedia, multisensory piece, Study for Life, in 2019, 39 years after it was originally written, which involved the reconstruction of the since-lost original tape. This piece is based on a T.S. Eliot poem and includes a smoke machine and even imported smells. Its original incarnation was her first time writing for voice, since Heinonen put the kibosh on that in school. Saariaho's system of creating and manipulating basic spectral sonorities mapped really well onto opera. Instead of giving each character or idea a unique motif or theme, each gets their own spectral chord. As the characters interact, there are all sorts of layering and interpolation possibilities. The New York premiere of her first opera, L'amour de loin, was the first time the Metropolitan Opera had staged a work by a woman in 113 years. Her large-scale works, from Du Cristal to her second opera, Adriana Mater, relate to her experiences as a mother, from the gentle polyrhythms of two hearts sharing one body to the conflicted feelings of watching your child grow old. Opera was more direct, and it became her primary medium for addressing social problems and the role of women in society. Adriana Mater deals with war and sexual violence, a mother's love, and forgiveness in complicated, dehumanizing times, implied to be the Balkans during the Yugoslav Wars, but not explicitly stated as such. Kaija Saariaho died of brain cancer in June 2023 as one of the most lauded composers of her era. Her life's work is a testament to her dedication to overcome her shyness and outsider status and use the novel resources of the time towards her expressive ends. Saariaho loved the small sounds that occurred on the cusp between one thing and another. She magnified that which was overlooked. My music is born from many kinds of sources, and with the help of many different tools, Saariaho said. Technology cannot compose for you. I didn't have any ambition to create a program that would do something complex and wonderful, because I want to do the complex and wonderful myself.